thank you very much again. I hope you can hear me. And so I will give you just a brief presentation on my broader PhD project. I entitled this paper From the Italian Fascist Rule to Jewish Internationalism to the Experience of the Ethiopian Jews. This paper will suffer a bit from a lack of knowledge that I have because I don't know Amharic, so and I didn't go to Ethiopia, so I'm dealing with people that I didn't meet properly in the local context and with the proper archives, as I am doing a PhD in history. So I decided to focus on the American, Canadian, British, French, German, Italian international NGOs that helped and supported the cause of the Ethiopian Jews from the 30s to the 70s before their entitlement of the law of return in 1975. So I would start by saying that I'm Italian. I became aware of the Italian colonialism only at the university, as it's not a part of mainstream courses at the high school and middle school. And Italian fascist colonialism, that is considered as only colonialism to be studied in the Italian university, lasted from 1936 to 1941, even though it started after the Wollo incident in 1935, so in the October 35, and it was the last attempt to European powers to take part in the scramble for Africa against a country that was part of the League of Nations, as it was Ethiopia. And Italian fascist rule lasted for only 5 years. And during the 5 years, I think that Italians changed a bit the country and also challenged the identity of the minorities and religious groups in Ethiopia by splitting the Coptic and the Orthodox Church and using in an instrumental way the Muslim. And so, in this way, I became interested in the history of the Ethiopian Jews. So my question was, how was the attitude of the Italian fascist rule towards the Ethiopian Jews, how they interact with them? It's quite interesting, and it's quite renowned in the Italian Jewish history, the role that Carlo Alberto Viterbo played in the history of the fascist rule and Ethiopian Jews. Carlo Alberto Viterbo, that is the man on the left in the picture. Yeah, he was one of the leaders of the Italian Jewish communities. He was a lawyer. He was an anti-fascist leader, but he was supported by the fascists to spend a year in Ethiopia, even though he spent only 2-3 weeks in Gondar and around the Lake Tana, to visit the European Jews that they were in Addis Ababa and in Asmara, that they were part of the Italian Empire that time, and also to take care of the local Jews, as they were called in Italian, the falascia. Of course, denigratory term as an indigenous term. So Carlo Alberto Viterbo went there, and the history of the reports of the Carlo Alberto Viterbo are collected by the Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem. So there are all materials of Viterbo that he wanted to write an handbook on the history of the Ethiopian Jews. He collected the sources from Carlo Conti Rossini, Enrico Cerulli, other important Italian scholars, very fascist and very interested in the history of the Ethiopia and the literature of the Ethiopian context. But Carlo Alberto Viterbo only went to Gondar for a short period of time, so he gave us a brief diary and some information on how he found the falascia, what were the main customs, the main traditions of them, and it seems that he wanted to settle a kind of governorate to operate on behalf of the Ethiopian Jews, but in 1935 and then in Italy in 1938, Italy applied and implemented the racial laws. The racial laws were the laws, like in Germany and elsewhere, that discriminate blacks and Jews against the Italian legal framework. So in 1937, it was the first attempt. The fascists saw how these laws could work, and then they applied against Jews and against other minorities like Roma and Sinti people in Italy itself. So the question that I had with some colleagues of the Yad Vashem was, what happened, how we can apply, how they applied racial laws against Ethiopian Jews. Were the Ethiopian Jews part of the Holocaust? Did they live a kind of experience? I don't know many things about that. I know that some Ethiopian Jews that arrived in Israel in the late 90s, they claimed the Israeli government to have some reparations from the Italian one. I don't know if there is still this group or no, because they said that they suffered a kind of specific discrimination like they did the Polish Jews or Hungarian Jews for the German government. So I took these two sources from the newspaper that are available at the Israeli National Library. On the left, there is the source that says that the Falasha Jews pledged loyalty to Italians because the Italians, in a such manner, favored the condition of the Ethiopian Jews. They wanted to settle an agricultural school in Gondar. But on the same time, after Viterbo arrived in Ethiopia and after the application of the racial laws, Ethiopian Jews completely disappeared from the sources. So we know just that after 1941, when the British the British and the South African troops in Ethiopia, some of them they state, as in the newspaper on the right, that the property and the businesses of Jews in Gondar were confiscated, and many found necessary to hide their Jewish identity. So this seems that they suffered a kind of specific targeting as Jews by the Italians, even though some other scholars over the past years, like Summerfield, Stephen Kaplan, and others, challenge this problem, and whether they were targeted as Jews or just because they were simply, as black. And it's quite important to do other research that I'm doing, also by looking at South African National Archives for the troops that were involved there, and also to understand whether the Ethiopian Jews, they were killed in the Graziani massacre in February 1937 and the Debre Libanos massacre were targeted because they were Jews or just because they were part of the opposition to the Italian fascist rule. So this is quite... I still don't have an answer. It seems that those they were killed in the large-scale massacre. They were killed as part of the large-scale I would say genocide or murder, but to better know the history of some villages like Ambober village and other villages, it still needs to be researched by people, also by looking at sources to interact with each other. What it seems, and what is important to me, is that looking at the later period of the international groups, it was interesting to me because some Jews in Europe that they were helped by the international Jewish NGOs, they also said and they also revealed of the experience that they suffered. But in the later sources that I found, nobody talk about the Italian period, nobody says something about their discrimination. So Ethiopia, after this period, becomes, so after 1941, even though from the 30s it was still, a kind of ideal settlement for Jews. So I found out that like 10, 12 organizations were founded to settle Jews in the Jewish province, as they call, in Harar and in other parts of Ethiopia. So from 1941 to 1943, German, American, Italian, and French organizations, they wanted to settle their own Jews that they were suffered discrimination in Europe, in Ethiopia, because they consider Ethiopia as a non-anti-Semitic country and a kind of non-anti-Semitic Eden. So Ethiopia, for them, maybe compared to the Nazi Germany, was a better place to settle the Jews. But this long history of supporting this rescue of Jews and taking them to Ethiopia, it seems that it had a it was successful because around 6,000 Greek Jews, they came to Ethiopia and they were saved to stay in the country. But I don't know, it's just something that I read on the Palestine Post of 1950. So it's something that should be researched even with the Greek archives. So it's a very international web of Jewish solidarity, and also the Emperor Haile Selassie with Tamrat Emanuel, that he was one of the most important leaders of the community, wanted to settle a colony in the country for the Jews, for the European Jews, but we don't know how he interacted with the local ones, so with the indigenous Jews. So I go further to say that the organizations that they were involved in these operations were what we call the mainstream international NGOs. The American Jewish Distribution Committee, that is a much more neutral organization, the much more political World Jewish Congress, and of the Secours aux Enfants, so in its British British sector, I would say. The international NGOs, they hope for helping the Ethiopian Jews, and it's quite interesting after the birth of the State of Israel, why the international and Jewish NGOs linked with the Israeli government, they operate even though the Ethiopian Jews were not recognized as proper Jews. So it's interesting why did they so, what was their purpose, because in the same years after 1948, the Israeli government had a lot of exchanges and linkages between with the Ethiopian government, supporting agriculture and in the stuff of military support to the Ethiopian government. Also, we know because after 1963, the African Union was set in Addis Ababa, and so it was useful for the Israeli government to have other kind of governments supporting its cause against the Arab countries in the international fora. So another question that is quite relevant looking at the sources, it's whether this organization, the American Jewish Distribution, the World Jewish Congress, that they were involved in rescuing and helping displaced people after the Second World War in Europe, if they behave in the same manner towards the Ethiopian Jews, or if they had a different behavior. So, and in my idea that they had a different behavior. They target them as African, indigenous, third world people. So the behavior is completely different from what they did to help Polish, Italian, French Jews in Europe. So the key figures of this history are three: European and non-European, and American. Norman Bentwich, that he was also involved in the history of the British Mandate, professor at the Hebrew University, and in the late 60s and the early 70s, he created the Falasha Welfare Committee in London to support the Ethiopian Jews. Lilian Kasindorf-Kaveh, whose archive is in the Israeli National Library. So she had a long correspondence with Yona Bogale, that he was one of the most important figure of the history of the Ethiopian Jews. She was American. She worked in the bank sector, and then she came to Israel, making Aliyah to help the Ethiopian Jews. And the last one, she is Lady Rose Enriquez, a British painter, president of the British Society to help Ethiopian Jewish children, that she also worked to help the Ethiopian Jews. So looking at the different sources that I will give you now, just a brief, and then I'm over. I'm finished, sorry. We can see how the Ethiopian Jews, they were considered in these sources, particularly in the 60s and in the 70s, among the people of the international NGOs. So how they call them, how they interact with them, and yeah, that's quite interesting also to reflect on other stuff. Maybe that is not just related to the history of the Ethiopian Jews, but on a wider context. So, in this report of Norman Bentwich, he wants to support the large-scale immigration of the Ethiopian Jews to Israel. It seems that Israel doesn't want them, but he wants to send them, so this is a problem. And in these sources, it's quite relevant, in all sources that I found, neither the Ethiopian nor the Israeli government want that the Ethiopian Jews, they go to Israel, they want them there. So as I said before, why these organizations, they want to support like the immigration to Israel, and we know that the mass immigration only occurred in the 80s and in 90s. So they started to support Ethiopian Jews from the 40s, but only the immigrations in the 80s. We know the regime change that occurred in Ethiopia in 1973-74. So this is quite interesting to say why this international organization didn't wanted to support, and why Ethiopian government didn't want to let them to go, and the Israeli one too. The other thing is that when they talk of people that could go to Israel, and we know that in the mid of the 50s we had the experience of Kfar Batia, that it was a kind of school for Ethiopian Jews that came to Israel, around I think 50 people, 50 young people as a part of the youth Aliyah, they could come to Israel. And they say in the sources that they want to settle the families, but they only want to have young people, because young people, they could be much more easily integrated into the society. They could go to the klita, the process of the absorption, easily, in an easier manner. And also because they start by saying that even Ethiopian Jews will be recognized as Jews, they had to pass a process of kind of conversion when they will go to Ethiopia. It's quite interesting also that even in the sources, they somehow they call them as brothers, or everybody part of the Jewish family. It's a word that need to be civilized. So Ethiopian Jews, in the sources of the British society, they didn't live properly. They had many problems, like the disease that were caused by generation of incorrect feeding habits. And all the sources, they say, we have to teach them, we have to tell them how they have to behave. So yeah, Ethiopian Jews, they were like considered as a part of this process of a late burden, white man burdens and civilization process. So this is quite interesting in the sanitary diplomacy that they had to put hygiene and other kind of patterns to help them, as the joint did with the Mizrahim in North Africa with the Malben program. So to close, I would say that this is quite interesting because it opens the door to other research interrogatives, how the Beta Israel, they fit into the Jewish, and then in those years, in the 60s, 70s, in the Israeli history, how the problem of racism is intertwined with the humanitarianism is intertwined with racism, especially if you take into consideration the Jewish international NGOs, and also how Judaism has been considered for a long period as a white stuff, so as a white thing, or related to the European history, and how also to look at the history of the Beta Israel, it should entail an intersectional approach to look at their condition as blacks, to look at the condition as Jews in Ethiopia, and here Ethiopian and blacks in Israel. So also how their background also fit into this category, and so this is a research still on. So that's all. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak on the ramification of the boundary dispute between Ethiopia and Sudan on the Beta Israeli communities, with a special focus on Matama and West Armacho, Ethiopia from 1960s to 1980s. I would like to say a few points about the, actually I'm going to, my presentations are like this. I'm going to say a few points about the introduction. You know, unlike another the European countries, the boundary making in Africa has a very different history, because the boundary was carved and made based on the interest of the European colonialists. As a result, it has caused far-reaching consequences on the Africans, because ethnic groups sharing the common belongingness and history were split and left on different countries. Although Ethiopia is one of the non-colonized countries in Africa, and signed the boundary treaty with the European colonial powers, you know, the fate of its borders are not different from other colonized African countries, because you know, Ethiopia are sharing the contested borders with its neighboring countries, and borders are fragile, and it has caused the various repercussions on communities settled on the contested sections. Among other its neighboring countries, Ethiopia shares very long contested border regions with Sudan, which is not settled so far, and causing very intricate political dynamics so far. Basically, the boundary dispute between these two countries is emanated from the Article 1 and Article 2 of the 1902 treaty that was signed between Menelik II and Colonel Harrington. Because Article 1 was talking about the stretch of the line, whereas the Article 2 was talking about the issues of the authorization. But a year later on, that was in 1903, the British government unilaterally demarcated the boundary without the consent of the Ethiopian government and the people. In fact, the Green Line caused no immediate public protest from the Ethiopian side, and the boundary issue was not the serious political agenda between these two countries until 1950s. But in 1950s, the boundary issue between these two countries became one of the hot political agendas, because in 1956, Sudan became independent from the British colonialism. And on the other side, the Ethiopian government embarked on the expansion of the commercial agriculture, particularly in Setit Humera and the Metemma border areas that was started in 1955. So following the expansion of the commercial agriculture, several rest landholders from various localities of Begemdr were engaged on the commercial agriculture. But Sudan became very sensitive on the border issue and frequently attacked several Ethiopian farmers because they were arguing that the Green Line is an international boundary and that has to be maintained respected by the Ethiopian government. It's evident that the Beit Israeli communities in Ethiopia were historically known for the craft activities. Basically, this had been a basis for the survival of the Ethiopian traditional community and the continuity of the Ethiopian government. However, in 1960s, several Beit Israeli communities settled in various localities of Begemdr, embarked on the production of the commercial crops along the contested border regions. So in the early 1960s, the imperial government allocated large sections of uninhabited farmlands to different sections of the society, including the Beit Israeli farmers, the police, the army officers, who took part in the international peacekeeping mission in Congo and the Korea. In fact, this was made to check the status quo and the de facto administration over the contested border territories that was claimed by the Ethiopian government. With the financial and the technical support received from the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training, abbreviated as ORT, the Beit Israeli communities established the large-scale commercial agriculture that was known in Ethiopia as Beit Israeloj, Ersha, Beit Israeli farm, that was established in Abu Tair, Jabal Tair, Galaluban, located along the eastern side of the river Gwang in the early 1960s.
Three different places?
Yeah, 3 different places located along the eastern side of the river Gwang. That is the contested border areas claimed by the Ethiopian government, at the same time by the Sudan. Basically, years back, ORT had been very much active in empowering the Beta Israeli communities, especially on the preservation of the Judaic culture and offering the humanitarian support to the Beta Israeli communities. However, when the Ethiopian government began the commercial agriculture in the contested border areas in 1960s, in the 1950s, the ORT provided financial support to the Beta Israeli communities that was supposed to produce the surplus products. Between 1960s and the early 1970s, several Beta Israeli elders possessed an extensive territory located along the eastern side of the river Gwang Valley, locally known as Drmaga, Graruha, Godebe, Goredem, Senar, and Metama. This area really shows the farmland that was owned by the Beta Israeli communities. The map I took was produced in 1967 and it's currently kept in Gondar Archive Center. However, the expansion of the commercial agriculture along the river Gwang Valley faced a very stiff opposition from the Sudanese government because they were pushing both the Ethiopian government and the local people to respect the Green Line that was demarcated without the consent of the Ethiopian government. The worst was that the Sudanese frontier security forces destroyed the Abu Tair and the Jabal Tair farm base of the Beta Israelis in 1969. And this has caused several repercussions on the Beta Israeli communities because several tractors, the crops, and the shelters were devastated. And the incident has really caused the public cry among the Beta Israeli communities. What the Ethiopian government did in the meantime was that empowering the local security units, known in Ethiopia as Taraf Tabakiዎች or Tarafenya, and deployed few sections of the police forces in the contested areas. And at the same time, the Ethiopian government was trying to rehabilitate the Beta Israeli farmers, offering least interest credit services and supplying the inputs such as the tractors, seeds, and the duty-free fuel and anti-locust chemicals and the pesticides. But this does not bring the basic changes on the lives of the Beta Israeli communities. When I come to the dilemmas and the uncertainties, we know that in 1974 a regime change was made in Ethiopia, and this has really caused various political and the economic crisis upon the Beta Israeli communities. Because following the regime change in 1974, the Ethiopian government was not in a position to provide protection to the Beta Israeli farmers. And at the same time, the market failure was appeared particularly on sesame in 1975. In fact, the market failure, it was a result of the change of the foreign policy from the west to the east, and at the same time the political crisis, because in the border areas, that several rebel forces were attacking the Ethiopian farmers and at the same time the government supporters. So this has caused the multifaceted crisis upon the Beta Israeli farmers. One of the major commercial routes known as the Humera-Asmara route was closed and it was under the control of the Eritrean insurgents. And the letter that I took from the Gondar Archive Center states that የአገሪቱ የደም ስር ከሁመራ አስመራ ያለው መንገድ መዘጋቱ የጠረፍ ልማት እንቅስቃሴ እንዲቀዘቅዝ አድርጎታል። In English, as the country's main artery, Humera Asmara is closed, the frontier development has declined. Because of the market failure, that the Beta Israeli communities could not return the loan that they received from the Ethiopian government, and again could not pay the wages to the lay laborers. Secondly, as I said it earlier, as the agricultural basis of the Beta Israeli community was located in the contested frontier regions, that the Sudanese government frequently harassed and plundered the farmlands in the post-1974. For instance, the Koradam farmland was destroyed by the Sudanese government in 1975. And similarly, on 17 April 1975, that the Sudanese government did the same thing upon the Beta Israeli farmlands. The government set fire to the farmlands and the shelters belonging to the Ethiopian farmers and put an extensive farmland extending from Abderrag to Sennar under its sphere of influences. Tractors, agricultural tools, the shelters and the farmlands were plundered and confiscated by the Sudanese frontier police forces. When the Ethiopian Beta Israeli massively left their commercial agricultural base, that the Sudanese government allocated Abu Tair, Jabal Tir, and the foothills of the Galalubal mountain to its top army officers, the civil authorities of the Gadarif state, and the residents of the Gadarif. Abu Tair was exclusively given to Yusuf al-Haji, who had been the governor of the Gadarif state, Abu Bakr Omar, and the Omar Kabra, who was the chief of the Sufawa sub-district. As conditions in Ethiopia was not promising and the Beta Israelis were facing the multifaceted crisis, they were choosing looking for the other options. Probably this might be one of the pushing factors for the migration of the Beta Israeli communities in Ethiopia. Unfortunately, in the meantime, the Israeli government issued the operation plan that was supposed to relocate the Ethiopian Beta Israelis from Ethiopia to Israel through the border areas of Ethiopia and the Sudan. In fact, the need to relocate the Beta Israeli communities from Ethiopia to Ethiopia has received the national attention when the Liquid Party won the national election in Israel in 1977. In fact, the process of the operation was not easy because the border areas were politically tensioned. And there was an unusual interstate relation in the Horn of Africa. And again, the Cold War tensions had affected the process of relocating the Beta Israeli tribes from Ethiopia to Israel. Unfortunately, the Sudanese government became one of the collaborator and the major actor in opening the borders and again offering the temporary station camps to the Beta Israeli communities. And Sudan had been serving as one of the camping site to the Ethiopian Beta Israeli communities. So the Beta Israelis settled in the Wogara Raja and its environs were massively smuggled into the Sudan through Godebi, Wadikura route, while those who were settled in the border localities of the Kwara and the Metamma, such as Srimjaha, Wofta, Gunda Mariam, Abet Gabaho, Yesus, and Tuha were smuggled through Tiha. This is a picture that I took from the Gondar Archive Center that shows the migration of the Beta Israelis from Wogara Raja to the Sudan. And it was produced in 1984, really very worst. Smuggling the Beta Israelis from Ethiopia to Israel through the border areas was continued. It was continued throughout the 1980s in the early 1990s. This is the Israeli Prime Minister who was visiting the Ethiopian Beta Israelis who arrived in Israel in 1991. The history of the Beta Israeli in Ethiopia is one of the least studied and the scholarly overlooked research teams and is still waiting for the new interpretations. So this should be an assignment particularly given to we, the Ethiopian historians, the Israeli historians, even though academics has no border, that we need to work again. And this has to be, academically, institutionalized and empowered, and we need to strengthen our areas of the cooperation. This is what I have. This is a picture that I took from the Gondar Archive Center that shows the Beta Israeli girl who were camped in Sudan in 1984. Thank you very much.
So the Sudanese first destroyed the farms and
Yeah,
everything.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then
That scenario was already changed in
so they first
1980s.
destroyed the Beta Israel
yeah,
production,
yeah.
and then they encouraged the migration.
Yeah,
So it's very interesting.
Yeah, you know, in 1950s, in the 1960s, the Sudanese government had been very hostile to the Beit Israeli communities. But this political situation was changed in the late 1970s because, Sudan became very hostile to the Ethiopian government, and Ethiopia was the same to the Sudan, and now Sudan had been encouraging the Beit Israelis. This might be, the kind of the bargaining the power over the contested border areas.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to look at the Beta Israel people within the context of occupational groups in Ethiopia, craft workers. And I'm going to focus specifically on how generally the occupational groups in Ethiopia have been treated. And within that context, as occupational groups, at least for some time, how the Beta Israel people have been also treated. So I'm going to look at, in order to see this, I have tried to find out some materials which look like of the legal nature, prescribing or dealing with the status of the occupational groups in Ethiopia and see how these occupational groups have been viewed from the Ethiopian rulers. So studies in Ethiopia, this is a work in progress still. I have started the work very recently, and I started not with the Beta Israel per se, but with the occupational groups in Ethiopia. So I have the intention still to dig into more literature to see within occupational groups how the Beta Israel people have been treated by the Ethiopian rulers, typically how the different so-called legal materials, decrees and others have treated the Beta Israel people. So my interest in this work started with how the craft workers are depicted in the literature in the Ethiopian anthropology and history, right? So just to start with some introduction to put things in context. So craft work in Ethiopia is widely practiced, right? So in wider sense of the term, virtually all Ethiopians practice some type of craft, right? They practice some type of craft. That also applies to the Beta Israel. For the Beta Israel, the literature suggests that, okay, once they were probably farmers or they lived as other Ethiopians pursuing mixed livelihood, for example, agriculture and doing small crafts and this and that. But during the period of Isaac, in the 14th century, literature depicts as though they have completely turned into craft work. But that craft work has some sort of continuity. So they used to do some sort of craft before, and when they were marginalized and were forced to abandon farming because their land was taken away, they rather wanted to concentrate on the craft work. Otherwise, craft work was not a new invention that came all of a sudden as a result of some specific historical incident. So I'm saying this to say that, okay, craft work has been virtually the practice of every community, Ethiopian or probably also any other African society. So the intention that craft work is a mainstay of only a specific community is not necessarily true, in the sense that, as I said, virtually every household has some craft to do, right? So this is one of the lacking nuances in the literature of craft work in Ethiopia. So when we talk about craft, the literature is preoccupied with such craft activities like pottery, weaving, blacksmiths, and hide workers specifically. So not only that, almost all Ethiopians have the skill of doing some sort of craft. They are also found in every, even if we talk about some concentrated occupational groups, these occupational groups are also found in all parts of Ethiopia. They are not just in the south, in the north, in the east, in the west. We can find them in almost all parts of the country, regardless of culture or religion. Probably some parts have more concentrated occupational groups. Otherwise, they can be found in all parts of the country. Not only the fact that craft workers are found in almost all parts of the country, so is their marginalization. So Donald Levin says that marginalization of craft workers is a pan-Ethiopian trait. It is wherever they are found, these craft workers are marginalized. But the literature is so monolithic. This is where I started to ask, is so monolithic. It does not nuance about marginalization of craft workers. There are a number of questions that one can ask after having read the literature on the Ethiopian craft workers. So the first one is the literature depicts the position of occupational groups as invariably negative. It completely portrays that the situation or the condition of craft workers is negative. It depicts only the negative picture, as these occupational groups live in a completely dark situation. So it does not try to find out some evidences of how potentially these craft workers have received some sort of positive treatment, either from the mainstream, so-called mainstream society of Ethiopia, or the rulers themselves. This is one. The second one is most of the studies are also bottom-up. In anthropology, the studies focus on how these occupational groups have the interaction with the horizontal interaction between the occupational groups and the mainstream society. The literature lacks nuances of how these communities have been treated from the top, from how Ethiopian rulers saw the occupational groups. Of course, it is not also gendered. And also, literature also concludes that marginalization is made due to occupations per se, but much of the marginalization is associated with a symbolism that is associated to occupations. And also other factors as well. For example, when it comes to the Beit Israel, I think the dispute is not mainly due to the fact that the Beit Israel are occupational groups or this or that. It is mainly due to the religious tensions between the mainstream Ethiopian Christian community and these Beit Israeli communities who have resisted to remain with their Jewish religion. But the literature just seeks to attach that, okay, these marginalizations come mainly because of doing craft per se, but that is not actually, that might be true, but that is not actually, the underlying reason. Okay. Now, so in this talk, which is, I would say, still very, very premature because I have to read the literature and filter far more evidences to reach at a certain conclusion. I would like to develop an idea that craft workers have received some sort of positive treatment. I am not denying that they have suffered a lot, the occupational groups, but there could also be, there were also instances whereby these occupational groups have been also positively viewed and accepted by, at least by the Ethiopian rulers, such as the Beit Israel. So in this sense, the legal history, I want to focus on the legal materials in order to pursue my line of argument or thesis. I would like to focus not every dimension of the literature, but something which is of legal nature. So how these groups have been treated by materials which are of legal nature. So the methodology, you can imagine, so far is literature review. I have focused on reading and understanding the literature in the region. Generally, my research interest is in northwest Ethiopia, even if I have also sometimes tried to study and publish on the other parts of the country. I have focused much on the north central, specifically north central Ethiopia, including my PhD is on one of the Agaw communities in northwestern Ethiopia, known as Kumpalin, Kwara, and Jewry, and Metakal areas. So, so far, based on the literature, I am trying to understand the literature by focusing on how specifically different legal materials tell us about how these occupational groups were treated. So I start with Ftanagast. So we don't find anything said about Ftanagast, I mean the Beit Israel, or any specific occupational group in the Ftanagast, but we have a lot said about occupations, the crafts on Ftanagast. So it is really, so Ftanagast, as I think as you know, is a legal material of a great significance in Ethiopia until 1931. The first constitution of Ethiopia came in 1931, came into effect in 1931, and that is the first modern legal material for Ethiopia. Until then, Ftanagast was a source of the law for the Ethiopian rulers. So how does that see occupational groups or occupations? So it is really positive about occupations. This material is really positive. So it says much about handcraft or crafts, which is ተግባረ እድ in Amharic. So it says ሁሉን መስራት ይገባል. It is important to work everything, right? ሁሉን መስራት ይገባል. And ስር ከመማስ ቅጠል ከመበጠስ. So apart from things which are of sorcery or things that are associated with attracting evil spirits, so it is important to do everything. What is not good is to do something which attracts evil spirits, such as sorcery. So ከመጠንቆል በቀር ጣዖት ከመስራት በቀር it is not good to do like idols. It is not good to call demons. It is not good to do this and that. But apart from those things, it is good to do any handcraft. So we don't have something to cook to make our sauce unless we have some ceramic materials. አንጥረኛ ከሌለ ጻህሉ የለም. Unless we have carpenter. We don't have materials. We would not have materials that we use like to build our house or our household or so and so forth. So it focuses, it gives a lot of pages talking about the importance of doing handcrafts. So yeah, this is one of the significant sources that we can learn about the attitude of Ethiopian rulers regarding occupations, which would also tell us about the status of occupational groups. And the next important source is King Isaac's. So Isaac proclaims, there is a famous, very often quoted proclamation or decree about the Beit Israel people even during the King Isaac. So King Isaac proclaimed, he who is baptized in the Christian religion may inherit the land of his father, otherwise let him be fallacy. So this is, scholars state that this is the first time that the word fallacy is used to mean falasha. I mean, falasha came from this Giz word, which is fallacy. So in order to survive, so it is at this point that, okay, land was taken away from the Beit Israel at this point, and then the Beit Israel people retreated into concentrating. They didn't start, as I said, all of a sudden they didn't start doing craft work, but they must have been doing some craft work, but they concentrated on doing craft work during King Isaac because they learned officially by proclamation was taken away unless they were baptized into Christianity. So this was something which gave them an additional incentive to become blacksmiths. So to look at the attitude of Isaac himself, Isaac was successful in importing Turkish and Egyptian technical advisors. So the Ethiopian rulers have always been interested in crafts, and they have always sought importing craft and craft workers, skilled craft workers from elsewhere, such as from Turkey, such as from Egypt. You know, Theodros, he sought to import craft workers or skilled people from British, and that was one of the disputes, and that was a reason to the end of his life even. The next one is Zarago. Travelers' record show that Zarago was not in favor of blacksmiths, especially. This is there is a sort of decree that is often quoted in the literature, saying that kill all sorcerers. But what does sorcerer mean? Does it mean really all craft workers are sorcerers? It is not. So the literature is in a way generalized that Zarago was against craft workers because all craft workers were assumed to be sorcerers. But Zarago was against the ones that I told you, like calling demons and this and that. He is against those things, not occupations or crafts per se. And again, yet during and since the reign of Zarago, a group of blacksmiths, including the Beit Israel, traveled with the royal court. As you know, the royal court in Ethiopia was most mobile. So they stay a few years or months at a certain place, and they move to another place, and they move. So, the craft workers followed the royal court because they have to do some crafts that the royal court will use. And Galaudius rebuilt churches and other buildings, and he was very much, he was in favor of craft workers, and there is one quotation, and he did not torment those who worked. You see, Galaudius, he did not scorn those who performed hard labor, and he inveighed against those who were lazy. So Galaudius himself was not against the craft workers per se. He encouraged those who work, and more specifically, the reign of Galaudius is well remembered in Beit Israel traditions because he liked them because of their craft, maybe not because of their religion, but because of their craft. They were hard workers. And again, Johannes' imperial policy was to keep them separate. This is one of the black spots in the relationship between the Ethiopian, the Beit Israel people, and the rest of the society. And Johannes had proclaimed a decree to segregate the Beit Israel people to live separately. It's not only the Beit Israel people actually, but Franks, Muslims, Turks, and also the so-called Falasha, and also called Kaila people. This is one of very negative proclamation decrees about the Beit Israel people. And Theodros was very much favorable towards craft workers. He was very keen to keep technological advancement of the country. During Theodros, even this is a text that shows that, how Theodros also saw the Beit Israel people somehow positively, and in a dispute between Orthodox Church and the Beit Israel people about the religion, Theodros, passed a judgment in favor of the Beit Israel people, because he was more convinced by the Beit Israel scholars about the Old Testament, about the religious debate. But this does not mean that he left them alone. Informally, at least, he didn't directly attack them, but informally, he persuaded teachers, religious teachers, still to convince them to peacefully be converted into the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Menelik's text, this is very long text, I'm sorry, but it is very important, not directly related to the Beit Israel, but will help us understand how the Ethiopian rulers treated occupational groups that potentially could also apply to the Beit Israel people. It says, let those who insult the worker on account of his labor cease to do so. This is a proclamation. Until this time, you called blacksmiths tayyib. Tayyib is like Buddha. Those who have the Shamma, tayyib is evil-eyed, Buddha. Yeah. So you have insulted those who wore the Shamma, you called them Shammani. Those who wrote, you called them Tangwai, or witch doctor. Those who worked for the church, you called them Dabtaras. The farmer who produced all our food and is known to be better even than the king, you called Gabari. The merchant who brought you gold, you called Negade, Gatabatabi, and insulted him on account of his trade. The lazy man whose son is ignorant causes trouble by insulting the clever man. So it goes on, it goes on, it goes on. Hereafter, the conclusion of the decree, anyone who insults those people is insulting me. So the king is saying this. From this time forth, anyone found insulting another or on account of his work will be punished by a year's imprisonment. This is a sort of relatively complete decree because it not only stipulates the normative regulations, don't do, don't that, it also stipulates punishments upon trespassing those regulations or decrees. Now, so the Italian occupation, and it goes, and it goes. Okay, so the point now is, so I will do more presentation next time. So the thing is, okay, it is really very premature to do this or that sort of conclusion, but I think that studying the materials of the legal nature about the craft workers in Ethiopia would give us the chance to a potential alternative interpretation of the literature, the history or anthropological literature about how the craft workers, including the Beit Israel people, are viewed by, in this particular instance, viewed by the Ethiopian rulers. Actually, much research, as I said, focus on contemporary relationship between the mainstream society and the craft workers, in which context, unfortunately, I think we cannot learn much about the Beit Israel, but looking at the historical context would give us, I think, an opportunity to see somehow, to nuance the literature on how the Beit Israel people were treated. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to read a paper because if I don't stick to the reading, I go too long. From the inception of the Jesus movement in the land of Israel to the spread of diverse church communions worldwide, Christianity has had to negotiate a core structural problem, namely, how to treat Judaism. Immersed in Jewish texts and practices of their time, the earliest Christ believers had to contend with the searing disappointment that most fellow Jews did not accept the sect's newly proclaimed Messiah and Savior. This crisis of origins pervades the seminal writings from the Jesus movement. Formative New Testament texts insistently vindicated faith in Jesus through reference to the law and the prophets, and just as insistently cast the Jews in the dual oppositional role of persecutors and hypocrites. However scholars today may contextualize the meaning of Paul's epistles authored in the early 50s of the Common Era, the apostles' earliest readers saw in his texts the foundation for Christianity's supersession and nullification of Judaism, two sides of the same conceptual coin. In a nutshell, to quote John D. Levinson, quote, "It is Christians through faith rather than Jews through birth who inherit the status of Isaac, son of the promise," unquote. The teaching that Christ believers supplant Jews in the covenantal bond with God, inextricably tied to Paul's teaching that Jesus supplants Isaac as the beloved son, undergirds a theology of replacement. Conversely, unbelieving Jewry forfeits its status as Israel. The apostle analogizes Israel to a cultivated olive tree. The Gentiles are wild shoots grafted in to share the richness of the holy root, while some of the natural branches, blind, disobedient, enemies of the gospel, spiritually dead, in other words, have been cut off. The hardening of his own people, the Jews, for Paul, a divine mystery, will endure until the full number of the Gentiles comes in, after which a remnant will accept the faith and find deliverance. And you can find that in Romans 11. For the nascent church, the very early church, God's compact with the Hebrews, their chosenness, passed to Gentile Christians, a transfer presaged by the election of the second-born son, Isaac, and Jacob over their elder brothers. Christianity arrogated to itself the legacy of Israel, whose scriptural patrimony it transformed into an Old Testament meaningful only in light of the New. The Hebrews' national story of redemption out of Egypt turned into a type of universal salvation, the Red Sea prefiguring the baptismal waters. Christian repurposing of the Jews' sacred heritage found expression in the trope, the Latin trope, verus Israel, true Israel, a phrase first attested about 150 to 160 in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. The claim of the true heir's rightful spiritual succession depends for its rhetorical force on the implied antithesis, the fleshly impostor. If Paul's early readers understood him to reduce Judaism to the killing letter of an antiquated defunct law, Johannine texts, that a text attributed to the evangelist John, dated to the turn of the 1st century, so later than Paul, John's texts demonized the Jews' parentage from the father of lies, the devil. That's in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, and their synagogues of Satan in the book of Revelation. Positive and negative constructs, an entity standing for life and love versus its inimical other, cooperated in a single metaphysical cosmology easily projected onto the world. Reaching all corners of a gradually evangelized ecumen, Christian scripture, accompanied by authoritative patristic interpretation, sacralized a binary logic that proved as durable as it was operationally flexible. From the Byzantine Empire to the kingdoms of the Latin West, the Old Testament served the invention of a spiritual genealogy for Christian polities, figuratively understood as the new Israel. A formulaic typology of Davidic kinship was metaphorically applied to rulers. So you can see here works of art which compare or represent David. They represent David in the guise of the Byzantine emperor. A voluminous scholarly literature details the many permutations and artistic manifestations of these commonplaces. So in this case, in Western art and Carolingian art from the 9th century, we see the Carolingian king as taking the place of David, or David in the guise of the Carolingian king. So too, the church fathers' reading of the New Testament pervade a complementary diatribe against Judaism that came everywhere to afford a powerful tool through which to frame local, doctrinal, ecclesiastical, and political adversaries, regardless of actual religious affiliation. In other words, the language of anti-Judaism produced Jews. An analogous process played out in highland Ethiopia, but here the terms of the supersessionary paradigm radically shifted. So in these images, you have a distinctly Ethiopian iconography that translates Israel's prophet kings across time into a contemporary court setting. But here, what I want to say is that these are not based on a metaphorical understanding. Within the context of pre-modern Christendom, only Ethiopians forged a carnal genealogy of actual Israelite descent. No Christian polity went as far as Ethiopia did in assuming the mantle of chosen peoplehood literally to fashion itself as a manifestation of Israel in the flesh. Such a self-image, however, did not result in a friendlier representation of Jews. To the contrary, the greater the investment in Solomonic kingship and the recreation of Zion, the greater the embrace of Old Testament ritual developments that gathered momentum over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, the greater the imperative to disavow even the intimation of Jewishness. The more carnal and literal the supersession, the more acute the need sharply to dissociate becoming Israel from becoming Jewish. On the semantic plane, the word for Israelites, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, Esraelawian, favorably designates those of Solomonic stock, usually members of the ruling dynasty, and as Sophia de Gemuller has pointed out, connotes physical beauty. Unlike the Hebrews of the Old Testament, duly Christianized, Jews, or Ayhud, make an execrable appearance in the New Testament, from which derives their moniker crucifiers. The extension of the slur Jew or Ayhud to derogate political rebels or Christian schismatics parallels the Judaizing of heresy and usury rife in Byzantium and the medieval West, respectively. The structural anti-Judaism that the Ethiopian critique of social enmity presupposes and exposes had significant ramifications for the Beta Israel. The counterpart to the group's alienation from Israelite kinship, to which it also laid claim, was the imposition of somatized difference. The mythic kernels of Israelite ancestry may perhaps hark back to the 6th century. Then, for the first time, the Christian king of Aksum took a biblical name, Caleb. Took the biblical name Caleb, who ruled from 514 to 543. Now, in the Bible, Moses had appointed Caleb, leader of the tribe of Judah, to scout Canaan with Joshua. God later rewarded Caleb along with Joshua by allowing them, alone among those who had departed Egypt, to enter the promised land. The Aksumite Caleb burnished his credentials as a Christian hero by subjugating the Himyarite kingdom in the southwest tip of the Arabian Peninsula, then under a Jewish ruler. Himyar may have conceivably been a conduit for the influx of Israelite motifs into Ethiopia. But whatever the 6th century background, the theme of royal Solomonic lineage circulated already under the so-called Zagwe dynasty, The dates are 11th century to 1270. Egyptian sources recently redated to the 11th and 12th centuries depict Ethiopia as the kingdom of the Queen of Sheba, whom legend credited with bearing Solomon's son, and also as custodian of the Ark of the Covenant. The early 12th century ruler Tantuedem took the regnal name Solomon, and his nephew Yemrahana Krestos was addressed as David. Other formulations of Israelite descent had currency as well, notably from Solomon through a woman in the queen's retinue, and from Moses through his Cushite wife. After seizing power in 1270, the Amhara rulers wrested the revival of the Solomon and Sheba legend from a Tigrayan challenger to promote their own legitimacy. Although the new dynasty most successfully exploited Solomonic pedigree, non-Amhara groups too created a place for themselves within the overarching Israelite framework, including the Beta Israel. The most famous locus for the elaboration of the liaison between a wise, pious queen of the south, or Sheba, Makeda, and King Solomon is, of course, the Kebra Nagast. At the close of the epic, a colophon represents the work as the product of translation in two continuous phases. A team of monks under the aegis of Aksum's preeminent churchmen state that they rendered an Arabic text into Ge'ez as an enterprise securely dated between 1314 and 1321 or 22. The Arabic version, the colophon continues, had been prepared in 1225 from a text preserved in a Coptic manuscript. By the time the 14th century translators had completed their edition, they had gone well beyond establishing Solomon's progeny, Ben Alechem, or Menelik, anointed David on the throne, and spiriting the ark with its contents, the tablets of Moses, out of the Jerusalem temple to dwell in Ethiopia. They had engineered Israel's translocation in total. For on Ben Alechem, or Menelik's return home, the leader of his Israelite retinue, Azariah, son of the high priest Zadok, publicly expounds the law, and the people collectively vow to observe its precepts. In other words, the Kebra Nagast has a scene that's basically copied right from or calqued on the Bible, Moses doing the same thing. The Kebra Nagast thereby has Ethiopia take up the religion of biblical Israel, become Israel, in preparation for Christianity's eventual arrival. Several scholars, including Pier Luigi Piovanelli and Sofia Degemuller, have noted the anti-Jewish animus of the epic's final section, some 22 chapters. I would go further to characterize quite a few additional chapters from the beginning and middle sections as well. But anti-Judaism is not merely epiphenomenal to an otherwise innocuous romance and national origin story. This anti-Judaism drives the raison d'etre of the early 14th century text. The Kebra Nagast puts narrative meat on the bones of the Apostle Paul's chiastic genealogical splitting. On the one hand are, quoting from Romans, Israelites, on the one hand are Israelites to whom belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, the promises, and the patriarchs, ancestors of Christ according to the flesh. On the other are unbelieving Jews not to be counted among Abraham's descendants according to the promise. Moreover, the Pauline disjunction governs the fleshing out of the text's central Marian allegory, the tabernacle and distinct divinely wrought pearl. The departure of the ark, along with firstborn sons of Israel's royal, noble, and priestly lineages, renders Solomon's land bereft of its soul, a preemptive punishment for future Jewish rejection of Christ. Therefore, Solomon lapses into sin, and under Rehoboam, the kingdom splinters. Thus does Judea land of the Ihud, or Jews, appear on the world stage ready for the drama of the incarnation and passion to unfold. The pearl, symbol of the Virgin, passes down with male seed from Adam through the Davidic line of Rehoboam till it rests in Anna. Ben Alechem is not a conduit, it says, I'm closely paraphrasing from the Kebra Nagas, because unlike his innocent people, it is the Jews who to their doom will deny and crucify Christ. Ethiopia enjoys the honor of Davidic Solomonic rulership while being spared the fate of the nefarious Jews. And here I do quote, God arranged things in this way, interjects the voice of the epic's omniscient narrator about the divided Israelite kingdoms, so that the ignorant Jews might not boast to us about Solomon and his son Rehoboam, because God anticipated how the Jews would argue. So, meanwhile, the Israel that arises in Ethiopia exceeds in righteousness the broken one, where the Jews, unworthy of the ark, will repeat their abnegation of God's words. So the epic affirms a twofold election squarely in line with Paul's celebration of the Israelites and his insistence on spiritual succession. Ethiopia incarnates an Israel that truly upholds Mosaic law under Solomonic rulers. Then, by virtue of its Orthodox Christianity, this Ethiopian Israel inherits the promise of redemption. The prestige of Israelite descent went hand in hand with the integration of Old Testament ritual into the formation of a national religious identity. And here I'm referring to the resolution over the Saturday Sabbath, the controversy that engulfed the Solomonic kingdom, and also practices of circumcision into which Azari Yaakov intervened. Old Testament observances scandalized Portuguese Catholics and Iberian Jesuits who branded it a heretical corruption of orthodoxy. One line of modern Orientalist scholarship imagined it as less as a lapse into Judaizing than as a survival of Judaic practices from a pre-Christian past. Other commentators have sought to explain Old Testament rites through analogies to Protestant imitation. But Ethiopian Saturday Sabbath, circumcision, and dietary prescriptions amount to none of those things. Rather, the settling of the ritual template in the mid-15th century under Tsar Yaakov regularized Orthodox practice with respect to a legend of Israelite inheritance from which dissidents and political enemies, like the Beta Israel, could be excluded. Zara Yaakov's chronicler applauded him as the, quote, destroyer of the Jews, an umbrella term for heretics, sorcerers, idolaters, and political enemies, including the Beta Israel. Zara Yaakov's theological tract, Mashafa Berhan, the Book of Light, opens with a salvo against Jews. But you, O Jew, you fetid and rotten mouth, eater of his sons and daughters like a hyena, and eaters of excrement like a dog. It appears to have gone unnoticed that the Negus here channels the church father John Chrysostom, whose eloquence he greatly admired and referenced in the Meshafa Berhan. John the Golden Mouth had preached a series of sermons in Antioch in 386-87 in which he parlayed the hyena's infamous reputation for sordid alimentary and sexual behavior into trenchant anti-Jewish invective. Zari Yaakov conjugates the hyena motif with other animal caricatures from the same sermon. The image of the hyena cannibalizing its own offspring echoes Chrysostom's depiction of Jews, demons, this is Chrysostom now, demons dwelling in their souls, slaying their own sons and daughters, more savage than any wild beast, driven by a brute lust beyond that of irrational animals. One more paragraph. Centuries later, the traveler James Bruce in the 1770s and modern era missionaries from the 1830s to the 1930s relate the pervasive popular belief that the Beta Israel embodied the spirit or essence of the hyena into which they physically morphed at night to devour corpses or consume their victims' blood. Scholars have tied this nocturnal shapeshifting to folkloric tradition. According to this view, demonic magic belatedly stigmatized the Beta Israel only once the marginalized group had become increasingly impoverished, dependent for their income on despised trades involving the fiery transformation of matter in the ironsmith's forge for men or the potter's kiln, women. But I propose an alternative hypothesis. The hyena's association with the Beta Israel, I suggest, harks back to the bestialization of Jews that the Solomonic kings, notably Zahara Yaakov and the Ethiopian clergy, took over from a prominent search father. Just as Israelite descent manifested in the body, so the evil nature controlling the Jewish soul acquired a somatic imprint. The Latin West, beginning in the later 12th century, birthed a genre of deluxe illuminated manuscript, the Bestiary, that elaborated on early Christian sources to identify Jews allegorically with a hypersexual necrophagic hyena. Ethiopians for whom the true or new Israel topos exceeded the figurative or metaphorical register of meaning perceived the Jews' satanic parentage to operate through Beta Israel hyenanthropy. Thank you. So I was asked to say something about how the Beta Israel responded to this kind of anti-Judaism, and all I can say is that Beta Israel survived, right? Like Jews everywhere, and that's how you responded. That's all I can say.